Okay, so this is a translation and a discussion of Pliny's letter 616, chapters 14 through 16, and today's date is August 27th, 2025. Said Aria, but the area, and then here is a relative clause, out of which the room was gone into or was entered. This is a classic example of the impersonal passive that Latin likes to use all the time. They would not say the boys came into the room, they would say it has been come into the room by the boys. And so therefore that is why we use the passive with a verb that is of course ire. So this area which is right outside of the room, it had risen, surrex erat pluperfectly, having been filled now in such a way with ash and with pumice stones having been mixed in, that as a result. We have a result clause because that is one of those degree words. If the delay, mora morai, which is a noun from the deponent verb, moror morari moratasum, if the delay implied was longer in the bedroom, in other words, if they had stayed in the bedroom for a longer period of time, the exitus, the exit, would be denied. An imperfect subjunctive in the apodosis, the then clause of a conditional statement that we have with that C that is there. Excitatus, here it is modifying our subject. He, referring obviously to Pliny the Elder, having been awakened, he proceeds. He goes out, que, and he returns, redo revere, himself, say, to Pomponianus and to the rest of the guys, and then another relative clause, who had stayed awake. And so therefore, we're obviously contrasting again the calmness of Pliny the Elder, who is able in a moment of crisis and terror and the eruption itself, able to take a nice nap. The other guys, they were not able to do so. They had obviously stayed awake. In common, so all together, they consult. They are making plans. And this is, of course, on, meaning whether or. And so here what we'll have is that normally it would have been an utrum, and we can just understand an utrum as though it were, of course, a part of that clause. So whether they should stand, they should stay inside the literal things having been covered. However, we can substantize that perfect passive participle from the verb tego, tegere, texi tectus, literally to cover, a thing having been covered, is a house. And so therefore, whether they should stay inside the houses or whether they should wander, wago, wagare, in the open, as it were. So they make a decision as to whether they're going to stay indoors or whether they're going to go outside. There are dangers in each one. Indoors, obviously, is going to be problems of the earthquake and perhaps a collapse of the building, or outside, all of the raining down stones and pumices and things like that. For the houses, literally, the things having been covered, they were nodding. In other words, they were shaking, but nuto nutare means to nod. With frequent, that's what creber means. It means obviously frequent, and vast tremors. So they were shaking, they were nodding with vast and frequent tremors, and the seemed, those houses, having, or I should say, as if having been moved from their own seats, from their own foundations, now hither and now thither. And so, of course, they seemed to go away, now hither and now thither, or to be brought back, now hither and now thither, having been moved from their own seats. And so it is essentially saying that they seemed that they are, having been moved from their own seats, they go over this way, and then they go over that way. And so to read it again, and as if, having been moved from their own seats, they seemed, those houses, the buildings obviously, now either to go away, hither, now to be brought back, hither or thither. Under the divine, this is a shortened version of Dewo, which of course means a god, but it also is going to mean then the open sky. So under the open sky again, although, and so this tells you which one they chose of the two. They decided to go out in the open and not risk the collapse of the house. So under the open sky, again, although the falling, and again, this is the fourth principal part of the verb kado, kadere, kekiri, kasus, in which we make it into a fourth declension noun, meaning the actual act itself. Although the falling of the pumice stones. And then we have, of course, two words for those pumice stones. The one word that is modifying it is levium, They, of course, are light. They are, of course, very porous, and as such, they are not very, shall we say, deadly, but nevertheless still a danger. And then, of course, exorum is going to be the perfect passive participle from exedo, exe, adi, esus, having been consumed. And so, therefore, the falling of those pumice stones having been consumed, and light, and having been consumed, was feared. And so under the open sky, again, under the divine, again, that's what they choose, although the falling of those consumed, having been consumed, and light pumice stones were being feared. A thing which, quod, and so the decision of going outside, however, a collaboration of the dangers selected. And so essentially what he's saying here, when they make an assessment of all the various different factors, all the various different dangers, the collection of those dangers selected going outside. And so collatio is the nominative as the subject of elego, elegere, which means to choose. And so the collection of those dangers chose it. That being the quod, the act of going outside. And among that guy, referring obviously to Pliny the Elder, indeed, rationale conquered rationale. In other words, he put the pros and the cons, made a logical decision, but amongst the other guys, fear conquered fear. And of course we have here a chiasmus of ratio A, timor A, rationem the accusative B, and timorum B. Basically, it is showing the contrast in which he makes the decision to go outside by obviously completing the math problem of saying that your chances of survival is better there, whereas they're just obviously choosing whatever is going to make them less scared. Again, a contrast of the bravery and the rationale and the scientific calculations of Pliny the Elder versus everybody else who is obviously weeding out due to their emotions, as it were. They tie, stringo stringere, cushions. This is like the cushions you have on your house or your couch at home. So they tie cushions having been placed on their heads with linens. And so they're tying them obviously as kind of like makeshift helmets. And this thing was, fuit, has been the fortification, the defense, as it were, ammunition, adversus, facing or against. Here in this context I would go with against the falling, incendentia. And so essentially they go outside and they're going to tie cushions on their heads, and that is the way by which they are going to try and protect themselves from the constant falling of the pumice stones and the like. So nevertheless, good luck, and thanks so much for studying. Make sure you learn your vocabulary, make sure you learn the forms, make sure you learn the structures. Good luck.